61 billion. That's the number of human beings Paul Atreides is directly responsible for killing. Not as a villain, not as a monster, as a hero, as the chosen one, as the Messiah every prophecy in the known universe seemed to be pointing toward. Let that settle for a second. 61 billion people. The entirety of human civilization on Earth today, wiped out 8 times over. And in the Dune universe, that event, the Jihad, the holy war fought in Paul's name, is considered the outcome of a success story. Paul fulfilled the prophecy. Paul became Muad'Dib. Paul saved his people. Paul won. Here's where it gets interesting. Frank Herbert didn't write Paul Atreides as a warning despite his success. He wrote him as a warning because of it. The tragedy of Paul isn't that he failed, it's that he succeeded completely, and that the success itself was the catastrophe. We're going to spend the next 2 hours inside that idea. We're going to move slowly through the entire arc of Paul's life, where he came from, what was done to him before he was even born, what he chose and what was chosen for him, and what it actually means that the greatest hero in human history is also its greatest killer. But I want to start with something that doesn't get said often enough about Dune. This story isn't really science fiction, in the way you might think. It's not about spaceships. It's not about alien worlds. It's about belief. It's about how human beings construct meaning, how we create gods and messiahs and holy wars, and how the most dangerous person in any civilization is the one who actually believes the story everyone told them. Paul Atreides believed the story. That's the whole tragedy. "10,000 years before Paul was born, an order of women called the Bene Gesserit began what might be the longest con in human history. They called it the Missionaria Protectiva and the Breeding Program. And together, those two projects were designed to do exactly one thing: produce a being with perfect, unlimited prescience, a human who could see all possible futures simultaneously. Think about what that means for a moment. For 10,000 years, these women tracked bloodlines across entire planets. They selected which nobles would marry which other nobles. They manipulated dynasties, assassinated uncooperative fathers, arranged the births of specific children. They worked in secret, behind a facade of religious mysticism, whispering in the ears of emperors, while quietly running the most sophisticated eugenics program the species had ever attempted. And Paul Atreides was the end result. Or rather, he was supposed to be one generation too soon. Here's the part that gets overlooked. The Bene Gesserit didn't want Paul. They wanted Paul's sister. Their calculations said the breakthrough would come in the next generation. That they needed Paul's mother, Lady Jessica, to produce a daughter, not a son. That daughter, bred to a specific Fremen warrior, would have been the Kwisatz Haderach they were looking for. But Jessica loved her Duke, Duke Leto Atreides, and she wanted to give him a son. Or so she made a choice, a deeply human, deeply emotional choice. Driven by love and loyalty, she bore a son instead of a daughter. She derailed 10,000 years of careful planning for a single moment of personal feeling. Let's sit with this. The person who set the apocalypse in motion wasn't a villain. It was a mother who loved her husband. There's something almost unbearable about that. Paul didn't choose to be the Kwisatz Haderach. He didn't choose his bloodline, his gifts, his destiny. All of that was constructed around him by people who would never meet him, people who had been dead for centuries by the time he drew his first breath. He came into the world already shaped by a machine he hadn't consented to and couldn't escape. The Bene Gesserit didn't just breed his body. Through the Missionaria Protectiva, their program of pre-planted religious myths seeded across primitive planets, they also bred his legend. Centuries before Paul arrived on Arrakis, Bene Gesserit missionaries had whispered prophecies into Fremen culture. They had planted the image of a messiah who would come from off-world, whose mother would be a reverend mother, who would lead them to paradise, who would be known by a sacred name. They built the myth first, then sent the man to fulfill it. So when Paul arrives on Arrakis as a 15-year-old boy who has just lost everything, his home, his father, his entire civilization, he doesn't walk into a blank world. He walks into a story that was written for him, a story about him, a story that he is uniquely, terrifyingly qualified to step into. You have to wonder if it ever felt like a choice at all. Arrakis is the only place in the known universe where melange grows. Spice, the substance that makes interstellar travel possible, that allows the guild navigators to fold space, that extends human life, that unlocks limited prescientability in those sensitive enough to receive it. Without spice, the Imperium collapses. Without spice, civilization, as the Dune universe knows, it simply stops. And the spice only exists on one desert planet, one brutal, sun-scoured, almost waterless world where massive sandworms patrol the deep desert, and the native Fremen have spent thousands of years learning to survive in conditions that would kill an off-worlder in hours. This isn't incidental to the story. Herbert designed this on purpose. He was writing about oil. He was writing about the 20th century and the catastrophic human tendency to concentrate ultimate power in a single irreplaceable resource, and then build empires on the assumption that the resource will always be there. House Atreides doesn't go to Arrakis because Duke Leto wants to. They go because the Emperor orders them there. As a trap, actually, because Leto has become too popular, too respected, and the Emperor fears what a beloved Duke with a loyal army might do. Paul arrives on Arrakis, and the spice begins to change him immediately. He's been taking small amounts of melange since birth. Everyone in the Imperium does. It's in the food, in the air near Arrakis. But the concentration on the planet is different. The spice saturates everything. And Paul, with his Bene Gesserit training and his carefully constructed genetics, begins to slip. He begins to dream. And the dreams are not metaphors. This is where we have to talk about prescience, because it's the central mechanism of Paul's tragedy, and it's genuinely more frightening than it first appears. Paul doesn't see the future the way a fortune teller does. In vague symbols and impressions, he sees specific moments with crystalline clarity. He sees conversations that will happen months from now, battles that are still years away, faces of people he hasn't met yet. And here's what makes it horrifying. He can't always tell the difference between the vision and the moment he's living in. There's a scene, early in his time with the Freeman, where Paul looks at the woman Chani and knows with absolute certainty that he loves her, not because of anything she's done yet, but because he has already lived moments with her in his visions thousands of times over. She's already familiar to him. She already feels like home. He is grieved for her before she has ever smiled at him. Let's sit with that for a moment. Paul never gets to fall in love with Chani. He arrives already in love, already past the falling, living in a feeling built from shadows of a future he's trying not to see too clearly. The ordinary human experience of beginning, of not knowing, of hope and uncertainty and discovery is not available to him. Every relationship he has is haunted from the start. And then comes the water of life. The water of life is the bile of a drowned young sandworm, a substance so toxic that it has killed every man who has ever attempted to drink it. Only the reverend mothers of the Bene Gesserit can survive it, by converting it within themselves. When Paul drinks it, in a fever, during a crisis, when Chani fears he is dying, he does something no man has ever done. He survives. He converts it. And in doing so, he opens a door inside his own mind that was never meant to be opened. He sees all of it, every path, every future, every version of what might happen, fanning out ahead of him in an infinite branching tree of possibility. And somewhere in all those branches he sees something he cannot unsee, a single future, golden and terrible, in which his name becomes a war cry, in which the Fremen pour out of Arrakis across the stars, in which billions die, in which the jihad happens. And he sees that almost every path he could take leads there. Muad'Dib. The name Paul takes among the Fremen. It means the desert mouse, a small, quick creature that survives in the deep desert, that has adapted perfectly to a world that should kill it. The Fremen chose this name with care. It is not a name of power. It is a name of survival. And then there's Usul, his secret name given to him by Stilgar, used only within his troop, never spoken to outsiders. Usul means the base of the pillar, the foundation, the thing that everything else rests on. It is a name of intimacy and trust given in private, held between people who might die for each other in the deep desert. Paul has 3 names: Paul Atreides, the Duke's son, the off-worlder, the product of a breeding program; Muad'Dib, the public face, the legend, the growing storm; and Usul, the name that Chani calls him, the name that belongs to no prophecy at all, the name that is just his, just a person among people who know him. Here's where it gets interesting. Now, as the story progresses, Paul spends more and more time being Muad'Dib and less time being Paul. The legend swallows the man. The Fremen need a messiah, and he can feel their need pulling at him, reshaping him, asking him to be something larger and less human than he actually is. And because he loves them, genuinely loves them, has lived among them, has bled with them, has learned to see the desert as they see it, he lets it happen. He becomes the myth. Not because he's vain, not because he wants power, but because the myth is what they need. And giving people what they need is something Atreides' blood runs toward instinctively. This is one of Herbert's most subtle and most devastating ideas, that charisma is a trap, that the ability to inspire devotion is not a gift but a responsibility so heavy it deforms the person carrying it. Paul can make people believe in him. He can speak, and the Fremen feel the desert itself speaking. He can look at a man and see what that man needs to hear and say exactly that thing, and the man will go fight and die for him. And Paul does this not manipulatively, but genuinely, because he does believe in them, because he does want a better world for them. And the believing and the doing and the dying spiral outward into something he can no longer stop. There is a moment of quiet, easy to miss, where Paul watches a Freeman child draw his image in the sand as a holy figure. Simplified, ideal stylized, the way you draw a saint, and Paul looks at that image and recognizes it as something that has already escaped him. The child is not drawing Paul. The child is drawing Muad'Dib. And Muad'Dib is not a person anymore. Muad'Dib is a force. Forces don't have complicated inner lives. Forces don't lie awake at night, afraid of the future they're building. Forces don't love Chani with a desperation that has nothing to do with destiny, and everything to do with the way she laughs, and the way she argues, and the way she knows somehow that underneath all of it, he is still just a frightened 15-year-old boy who lost his father. Paul is still that boy, but fewer and fewer people can see it, and that loneliness, the loneliness of being known publicly and unknown privately, is one of the quiet tragedies inside the louder ones. Let's talk about Leto Atreides for a moment, because you can't fully understand Paul without understanding what he lost. Duke Leto is, by every measure, a genuinely good man. He is loyal, just, and unusually principled for a noble in a civilization built on feudal power and casual atrocity. He cares about his people in a way that is not performance. He actually goes to check on the water workers. He actually listens to his soldiers. He actually worries about whether the freemen trust him. He is the kind of leader who makes other leaders nervous precisely because his goodness is real, and real goodness is more threatening than ambition. And Leto dies betrayed by the man he trusted most, his personal physician, in a trap set by the Emperor himself and executed by House Harkonnen. He dies trying to kill Baron Harkonnen, his teeth smuggling a poison gas capsule, willing to sacrifice himself for the chance to remove the monster. He fails even in that. The Baron survives. Leto dies alone in a room with the person who betrayed him and the man he couldn't kill. Paul doesn't see it happen. Paul is already in the desert, already fleeing with Jessica, already beginning the transformation that will make him Muad'Dib. He learns his father is dead from a distance, in the dark, with no body to mourn over, and no one around him who knew Leto the way he knew Leto. Here's the thing about grief that doesn't get enough attention in discussions of Dune. Paul never really grieves his father, not in the conventional way. He can't afford to. From the moment Leto dies, Paul is fighting for survival. Physical survival first, then political, then the survival of everything he's come to love on Arrakis. There is no space in his life for the ordinary human work of loss. He carries his father like a stone in his chest, a weight that never becomes lighter because it's never examined. And Leto's shadow shapes everything Paul does afterward. The justice, the loyalty, the deep discomfort with dishonesty, the way Paul fights for the freemen not just as a political strategy, but because Leto fought for the common people of every world he governed, and that value was transmitted so completely that Paul can't imagine operating any other way. He is his father's son, even when everything around him is asking him to be something else entirely. There's a scene near the end of the first novel where Paul is preparing for the final confrontation with the Emperor, and he thinks about his father, what Leto would have done, whether Leto would recognize him, whether the man Paul is becoming would make the man Leto was proud or horrified, and the answer is genuinely unclear. Leto was good. Paul is good. But the scale of what Paul is about to do, the war he's about to release, and the deaths already built into the future he can see, is something Leto's goodness was never calibrated for. Paul does what he does in part because he loved his father, and in part because he couldn't save his father. And those two things together, love and the particular guilt of survival, are almost always more combustible than ambition. You could write an entire essay just about Chani, about what she represents in the story, what she costs Paul, and what Paul costs her. Chani is the daughter of Liet Kynes, the imperial planetologist of Arrakis, and secretly the Fremen's most important figure, the person who has dedicated his life to a centuries-long project of terraforming the planet. She grows up in the deep desert, in the Sietches, and among people who understand that water is life, and that the desert will kill you without warning, and that survival is a collective project, not an individual one. She is competent, precise, and possessed of a clarity of vision that Paul, for all his prescience, sometimes lacks. She is not naive about Paul. She watches the legend growing around him, and she's not entirely comfortable with it. She loves Usul. She is less certain about Muad'Dib. She sees what the freemen need, and she understands why Paul is giving it to them, and she also understands, better than almost anyone, that the thing he's giving them might destroy him. And still she loves him. She chooses him in the freeman way, not because of prophecy, but because of who he is in the dark, when there's no one watching, when the desert is quiet, and they're just two people lying next to each other on a sleeping mat in the rock. She loves the person underneath the Messiah, and that love, by virtue of its very ordinariness, is the most precious thing in Paul's life. Now here's the part that breaks everything. Paul can see what's going to happen to Chani. He can see, with the same crystalline specificity, he sees everything. Moments of her grief, moments of her loss, moments that are coming whether he tries to stop them or not. He has lived those moments in vision so many times that they feel like memory. He loves her, and he already mourns her, and he cannot tell her any of this because telling her would change nothing except add her grief to his. So he is present with her in a way that has a kind of desperate quality underneath it. He's always slightly too attentive, always slightly too aware that this moment is finite. He knows things about their relationship that she doesn't, not just the future, but the weight he gives the present because of the future. And that asymmetry, that permanent imbalance of knowledge, means that even in the most intimate moments, they are not entirely in the same room. There's a Fremen saying Herbert uses, "The gift of water is the gift of life." On a desert world, water is so precious that it's given only between people who matter. To offer water is to say, "You are worth the most valuable thing I have." Paul offers Chani water in this way, early in their relationship, and the gesture is simple and enormous at the same time. He gives her what he has. He gives her all of it. He just can't give her the one thing she might actually need, which is a future where the story ends quietly. Let's sit with this. Chani's love for Paul is free and chosen and present tense. Paul's love for Chani is all of those things, and also haunted, also already nostalgic, already shadowed by foreknowledge, two people loving each other across a gap that neither of them can fully articulate. That's not a tragedy unique to Dune. That's something more universal than that. Herbert understood that the most human stories are always about the gap between what we know and what we can say. Paul knows everything, and the knowing costs him the ordinary consolations of not knowing. He cannot be surprised by joy. He can only anticipate it, and anticipation is a pale substitute for arrival. Here's something Herbert said in interviews that you should hold while reading Dune. He wanted to write a novel that would inoculate readers against charismatic leaders. He had been watching what happened when people surrendered their judgment to figures who promised to speak for God, or history, or destiny. He had watched the 20th century produce those figures in abundance. He wanted to write something that made the seduction visible. The Missionaria Protectiva is not just a plot device. It is Herbert's indictment of organised religion used as a control mechanism. The Bene Gesserit didn't plant those prophecies on Arrakis out of faith. They planted them as a tool, a way to protect their own members if they were ever stranded on a primitive world, by making the local population believe those members were divine. Religion as insurance policy, belief as technology. And then Paul walks into the myth they built. And here is where it gets genuinely unsettling. Paul knows the prophecies are manufactured. He knows the legend of the Mahdi, the Lisan al-Gaib, the off-world Messiah. He knows it was designed by women who saw his mother's people coming and prepared the ground for them. He knows it's a manipulation, and he uses it anyway. Because it works. Because the Fremen's belief is real, even if the prophecy is manufactured. Because the faith gives them courage, and the courage is genuine, and the courage wins battles that military strategy alone could not win. Paul uses a lie to produce real results, real liberation, real freedom for a people who have been oppressed for generations. And in doing so, he crosses a line that he can never fully uncross. He becomes complicit in the mechanism. He is not just the product of the Bene Gesserit's breeding program. He is now actively deploying their other weapon, the myth, in full knowledge of its artificial origins. He is a man who doesn't believe he's a god, using his people's belief in his godhood to lead them toward a future he's chosen for them because he can see further than they can. Now here's the part that gets overlooked. Paul genuinely believes in the Fremen. He believes in their cause. He loves Arrakis. He is not cynical in the way a pure manipulator would be cynical, but he is performing. And the performance is not honest, and every time a Fremen warrior dies for the Muad'Dib rather than for the cause, Paul carries a little more weight that belongs, at least in part, to the lie he's chosen not to correct. Herbert doesn't let him off the hook, and importantly, Herbert doesn't let us off the hook either, because we, reading the story, can see how seductive the myth is. We can understand why the Fremen believe, we can feel the rightness of their belief, the way it gives meaning to their suffering, the way it turns centuries of oppression into a sacred story with a promised ending. And we can hold both truths at once, that the belief is manufactured and that the belief is real, that Paul is using them and that Paul loves them, that the jihad is a crime, and that it was also, in some horrible calculus, necessary. Herbert forces us to sit inside that contradiction. He won't resolve it for us. He won't tell us whether Paul is a hero or a villain. He just shows us a person making the best choices he can see from where he's standing, with imperfect information about everything except the future, and asks us whether we would have done differently. Most of us sitting comfortably outside the story would like to think we would have, but I'm not sure that's honest. Paul wins. Let's talk about what winning looks like. The final confrontation in Dune is, on the surface level, a triumph. Paul challenges the Emperor Shaddam IV to single combat, or rather, he makes it impossible for the Emperor to refuse without losing face entirely. He has taken the spice fields of Arrakis. He can destroy them. Without spice, the Imperium collapses. Without spice, the Guild can't navigate. Without spice, everything that holds civilization together dissolves. Paul holds a knife to the throat of the universe, and the Emperor flinches. But before we get to the throne room, there's something that happens that the story almost buries in the momentum of its climax. Paul's infant son, Leto, named for his grandfather, is killed during a Harkonnen raid. A child he has seen in visions, a child whose voice he has imagined, a child who dies before Paul has the chance to know him. And Paul absorbs this. He keeps moving. He has work to do. The grief is real. You can feel it in the text, in the quality of his silence, in the way he looks at Chani, and neither of them says anything at all. But he keeps moving, because stopping is not something the moment allows, and because Paul Atreides has spent years learning to carry weight that would flatten most people. He goes into the desert. He takes the water of life again. He sees. He confirms what he already knew. The jihad is coming. It is already in motion. There is no stopping it now, only directing it, only ensuring that when it ends there is something worth saving on the other side. And then he faces the Emperor, and House Harkonnen, and the entire political machinery of the Imperium, alone except for the Fremen who love him. And he wins, cleanly, completely, with a kind of terrible elegance. Here's where it gets interesting. The victory scene should feel triumphant. Herbert writes it so that it doesn't. Paul is not exultant. He is precise, controlled, slightly terrifying in the way that very intelligent people are terrifying when they have decided on something and are simply executing the decision. He threatens, and he means the threat. He watches the Emperor recognize that the balance of power has shifted irreversibly, and he feels nothing like joy, because he can see what comes next. He can see the jihad beginning in the very moment of his victory. He can see the freemen pouring out of Arrakis with his name on their lips and fire in their hearts, and he knows that he cannot stop it, that he has never been able to stop it, that his only power over the future was the ability to choose which catastrophe and to shape, slightly, what the world looks like when the catastrophe ends. Irulan, the princess, the Emperor's daughter. Paul takes her as his political wife, not because he loves her, but because marrying into the imperial line legitimizes everything. It is a ruthlessly practical decision, the kind of decision that kings make and people don't. And in making it, Paul is announcing, quietly, that he has finished being a person, in the ordinary sense. He has become a function, a historical force, the thing the child drew in the sand. He tells Chani that Irulan will be his wife in name only, that Chani is and will always be his real companion, that the distinction matters. And Chani accepts this because she is practical in the Freeman way, and because she loves him, and because she trusts him. But something shifts slightly, permanently, in the architecture of their relationship, because Paul has made a choice that affects her life without consulting her. Because the Muad'Dib has made a decision, and all Usul could do was report it after the fact. He won. And he's standing in the ruins of the life he wanted. Surrounded by the beginning of the war he was trying to avoid, holding political power over a civilization he never asked to rule. He won. The freemen who consume enough spice develop eyes that are entirely blue, iris and white both, a startling and unmistakable transformation. The eyes of Ibad. By the time Paul becomes Muad'Dib, his eyes have changed too. He is visually marked by the desert. He looks like what he has become. There's a moment where Paul looks at himself in a piece of reflective metal and sees the eyes. And the text is quiet about what he feels, but you can feel the enormity of it. He has been altered. The desert has written itself on his body in a way that cannot be undone. He can never pass as an off-worlder again, never return to who he was before Arrakis, never be seen without being seen as this thing the desert made him. That physical transformation is a metaphor, but it's also just real. The spice does that. The desert does that. And Paul, looking at those eyes, is looking at the distance between Paul Atreides and Muad'Dib made visible in his own face. Sway. Now here's the part that gets overlooked in most discussions of the first book and becomes central to Dune Messiah, the sequel. The eyes of Ibad are beautiful to the freeman. They are a mark of belonging, of endurance, of transformation through survival. But to off-worlders they are alien, unsettling, a sign that something fundamental has changed. Paul carries both reactions inside him. He is both the thing the freemen see and the thing the off-worlders see, and neither perception is entirely wrong. The rest of Paul's story, the 12 years between Dune and Dune Messiah, involves governing an imperium that was never meant to be governed by him, fighting a jihad he can't stop, watching the death toll climb toward the number we started with, 61 billion, and the power corrodes him. Not because power always corrupts, that's too simple, but because prescience without choice is not power at all. It's captivity in a gilded cell made of certainty. Paul can see everything except the one thing he needs, a future where none of this had to happen. He looks and looks and looks into the possible futures, and that future is not there. It was never there. The jihad was always coming. The question was only ever what came after. In Dune Messiah, the conspiracies against him multiply. The Bene Gesserit, the Guild, the Tleilax Su, it's the Princess Irulan, all working against him for their various reasons, all trying to break the hold he has over the Imperium and the religion and the spice. And Paul sees them coming. He sees almost all of it coming. He lets much of it happen because, in the branching tree of futures, letting the conspiracies reach their conclusions leads to fewer deaths than stopping them prematurely. He loses his physical eyes, a stone burner, a nuclear weapon designed to blind. And then something strange and terrible and very Herbert happens. Paul Blind continues to see. His prescience has deepened to the point where he can navigate physically by the visions, can function, can rule, can fight. He does not need his eyes anymore, because he's living so deeply inside the future that the present has become almost redundant. And Chani dies in childbirth, bearing his twins Leto and Ganima, who will carry Paul's legacy forward in ways he can barely see. Yeah, she dies and the prescience goes strange around the event, because Paul loved her enough that some deep part of him refused to look at this future directly. He knew and did not know. He grieved before and after, and the grief in between, in the actual moment, is a kind of blindness that prescience cannot cure. He walks into the desert, literally. It is the Fremen way. When a blind man can no longer contribute to the sietch, he walks out into the desert alone, and the desert takes him. Paul does this voluntarily, while still capable of survival by his prescience, as an act of abdication and grief and whatever passes, for him, for peace. He doesn't die. He disappears. He becomes a legend inside a legend. The preacher who wanders Arrakis and speaks against the religion built in his name. Now we come back to the title. Why everything you know is a lie. The lie is not a single thing. It's structural. It's built into the story at every level. The prophecy is a lie, manufactured centuries ago by women with a political agenda. The Messiah is a lie, a real person forced into a false shape by the expectations of everyone around him. The victory is a lie, a triumph that costs more than losing would have. The hero is a lie, not because Paul is villainous, but because the category of hero flattens something genuinely complex into something we can worship without discomfort. Herbert's argument, made quietly across 6 novels, is that this is how it always works. That the stories we tell about great leaders and chosen ones and historical turning points are always simplifications that hide the cost. That the hero's journey is a narrative we impose on messiness that doesn't naturally have that shape. Yet that when we look back at history and identify the moment when everything changed and the person who changed it, we are telling ourselves a story that helps us feel that the suffering had a purpose, and the purpose was us. Paul knows this. This is one of the most painful parts of his situation. He knows that the story being told about him is false, and he knows that the truth would not serve the people he loves. And he knows that the lie is doing real good even as it costs real lives. And he cannot find a place to stand outside all of that and breathe. The prescience is a lie too, or at least it is not what it appears to be. Paul can see the future, but seeing the future doesn't mean you can change it. If anything, it locks you into it more completely. Because once Paul knows what's coming, his every action to prevent it becomes part of the mechanism that produces it. He is not above the future. He is inside it, looking forward, seeing himself see, and the recursive quality of that is one of the things that slowly unmakes him. Here's where it gets interesting in a way that extends beyond the novel. Herbert was writing about something real, not prescience, but the specific kind of certainty that charismatic leaders project. The way they seem to know things other people don't. The way their confidence feels to the people around them, like access to a truth that ordinary people can't reach. The way that certainty is seductive because uncertainty is exhausting, and being told by a beautiful, compelling person that they know the way forward is such a relief after years of not knowing. Paul is compelling because he does know things. He's genuinely right about things in ways that seem impossible without prescience, and the people around him see him be right so many times that they stop questioning the moments when he might be wrong. Uncertainty stops being a messiah, and uncertainty stops being a messiah, and they need the messiah more than they need the man. So Paul performs certainty even when he feels none. He speaks with authority even when the future is cloudy. He leads even when he's lost, and the gap between his public face and his private experience widens. And in that gap, over years, something essential about him gets very quietly lost. This is not a story about a man who is corrupted by power. This is a story about a man who was destroyed by being loved too much, in the wrong way, for the wrong reasons. The Fremen didn't destroy Paul by hating him. They destroyed him by needing him to be something he wasn't. And he let them, because he loved them. And the loving and the letting went on long enough that eventually there wasn't much of Paul left underneath the legend. Let's talk about Leto Atreides for a moment, because you can't fully understand Paul without understanding what he lost. Duke Leto is, by every measure, a genuinely good man. He is loyal, just, and unusually principled for a noble in a civilization built on feudal power and casual atrocity. He cares about his people in a way that is not performance. He actually goes to check on the water workers. He actually listens to his soldiers. He actually worries about whether the freemen trust him. He is the kind of leader who makes other leaders nervous precisely because his goodness is real, and real goodness is more threatening than ambition. And Leto dies betrayed by the man he trusted most. his personal physician, in a trap set by the Emperor himself and executed by House Harkonnen. He dies trying to kill Baron Harkonnen, his teeth smuggling a poison gas capsule, willing to sacrifice himself for the chance to remove the monster. He fails even in that. The Baron survives. Yet Leto dies alone in a room with the person who betrayed him and the man he couldn't kill. Paul doesn't see it happen. Paul is already in the desert, already fleeing with Jessica, already beginning the transformation that will make him Muad'Dib. He learns his father is dead from a distance, in the dark, with no body to mourn over, and no one around him who knew Leto the way he knew Leto. Here's the thing about grief that doesn't get enough attention in discussions of Dune. Paul never really grieves his father, not in the conventional way. He can't afford to. From the moment Leto dies, Paul is fighting for survival. Physical survival first, then political, then the survival of everything he's come to love on Arrakis. There is no space in his life for the ordinary human work of loss. He carries his father like a stone in his chest, a weight that never becomes lighter because it's never examined. And Leto's shadow shapes everything Paul does afterward. The justice, the loyalty, the deep discomfort with dishonesty, the way Paul fights for the Freeman not just as a political strategy, but because Leto fought for the common people of every world he governed, and that value was transmitted so completely that Paul can't imagine operating any other way. He is his father's son, even when everything around him is asking him to be something else entirely. There's a scene near the end of the first novel where Paul is preparing for the final confrontation with the Emperor, and he thinks about his father, what Leto would have done, whether Leto would recognize him, whether the man Paul is becoming would make the man Leto was proud or horrified, and the answer is genuinely unclear. Leto was good. Paul is good. But the scale of what Paul is about to do, the war he's about to release, and the deaths already built into the future he can see, is something Leto's goodness was never calibrated for. Paul does what he does in part because he loved his father, and in part because he couldn't save his father. And those two things together, love and the particular guilt of survival, are almost always more combustible than ambition. Here's something Herbert said in interviews that you should hold while reading Dune. He wanted to write a novel that would inoculate readers against charismatic leaders. He had been watching what happened when people surrendered their judgment to figures who promised to speak for God, or history, or destiny. He had watched the 20th century produce those figures in abundance. He wanted to write something that made the seduction visible. The Missionaria Protectiva is not just a plot device. It is Herbert's indictment of organized religion used as a control mechanism. The Bene Gesserit didn't plant those prophecies on Arrakis out of faith. They planted them as a tool, a way to protect their own members if they were ever stranded on a primitive world, by making the local population believe those members were divine. Religion as insurance policy, belief as technology. And then Paul walks into the myth they built. And here is where it gets genuinely unsettling. Paul knows the prophecies are manufactured. He knows the legend of the Mahdi, the Lisan al-Gaib, the off-world Messiah. He knows it was designed by women who saw his mother's people coming and prepared the ground for them. He knows it's a manipulation, and he uses it anyway. Because it works, because the Fremen's belief is real, even if the prophecy is manufactured. Because the faith gives them courage, and the courage is genuine, and the courage wins battles that military strategy alone could not win. Paul uses a lie to produce real results, real liberation, real freedom for a people who have been oppressed for generations. And in doing so, he crosses a line that he can never fully uncross. He becomes complicit in the mechanism. He is not just the product of the Bene Gesserit's breeding program. He is now actively deploying their other weapon, the myth, in full knowledge of its artificial origins. He is a man who doesn't believe he's a god, using his people's belief in his godhood to lead them toward a future he's chosen for them because he can see further than they can. Now here's the part that gets overlooked. Paul genuinely believes in the Freemen. He believes in their cause. He loves Arrakis. He is not cynical in the way a pure manipulator would be cynical, but he is performing. And the performance is not honest, and every time a Freeman warrior dies for the Muad'Dib rather than for the cause, Paul carries a little more weight that belongs, at least in part, to the lie he's chosen not to correct. Herbert doesn't let him off the hook, and importantly, Herbert doesn't let us off the hook either, because we, reading the story, can see how seductive the myth is. We can understand why the Freemen believe, we can feel the rightness of their belief, the way it gives meaning to their suffering, the way it turns centuries of oppression into a sacred story with a promised ending. And we can hold both truths at once, that the belief is manufactured and that the belief is real, that Paul is using them and that Paul loves them, that the jihad is a crime, and that it was also, in some horrible calculus, necessary. Herbert forces us to sit inside that contradiction. He won't resolve it for us. He won't tell us whether Paul is a hero or a villain. He just shows us a person making the best choices he can see from where he's standing, with imperfect information about everything except the future, and asks us whether we would have done differently. Most of us sitting comfortably outside the story would like to think we would have, but I'm not sure that's honest. Paul walks into the desert, and the desert is quiet. That's where I want to leave him, not in the throne room, not in the moment of victory, not even in the grief of losing Chani. I want to leave him in the desert, blind, walking alone, feeling the sand under his feet and the heat on his skin, and knowing, as he has always known everything, that this was always where he was going. There's something almost peaceful about it, if you can sit with it long enough. Paul spent his whole life inside other people's visions of him. His mother's love, which was genuine, and which also made him what he was before he could choose it. The Bene Gesserit's program, which used him as the final proof of a 10,000-year project. The Fremen's faith, which saw in him the shape of every story they'd been told, would save them. The Emperor's fear, which recognized in him the end of an old order. Even Chani's love, as real and as free as anything in the story, and was shadowed by the legend that surrounded them both. In the desert, walking away, there is only the sand and the wind and his own feet. There is no one watching him be Muad'Dib. There is no one needing him to be Usul. There is just Paul, which is a name he almost forgot how to use. Now here's the part that gets overlooked when people talk about Dune as a cautionary tale. Herbert wasn't saying that Paul's life was wasted. He was saying that Paul's life was real. All of it, the breeding program and the desert and the love and the war and the walking away, was real, was lived, was felt. The tragedy doesn't cancel the beauty. The 61 billion deaths don't erase the moments by the fire in the Sietch. The quiet conversations with Chani. The first time Paul looked at the desert and understood why the Freemen loved it. Tragedy, in the classical sense, is not about waste. It's about the collision between greatness and limitation. Paul was great, genuinely, uncomplicatedly great in many of the ways that matter. He was brave and intelligent and loving and deeply, stubbornly committed to something that looked, from the inside, like justice. His limitations were not character flaws in the conventional sense. They were structural. They were built into the architecture of his life before he had any say in it. He could not have been born differently. He could not have landed on Arrakis and refused the desert. He could not have loved Chani less or the Fremen less or his father less. He could not have looked away from the visions. He could not have stopped the jihad any more than you can stop a storm by standing in front of it and explaining calmly that you'd prefer it not happen. What he could do, and did do, quietly, imperfectly, at enormous personal cost, was ensure that the storm passed and that something survived on the other side. Not 61 billion people, but something. A civilization made slightly more resilient by the catastrophe it survived, pointed slightly more honestly at the possibility of its own survival. Herbert's golden path, the concept that runs through the later books, is essentially this: that suffering, if it teaches the right lessons, can be worth it. Not in any simple utilitarian sense, but in the sense that a species which has survived its own worst impulses is slightly less likely to repeat them than one that hasn't. Paul saw the path as he walked it. He was destroyed by it. And what remains on the other side of that destruction is the possibility, fragile, uncertain, not guaranteed, of something better. That's not a triumph, but it's not nothing either. The desert keeps his secret. The Fremen tell stories about the preacher who wandered, who spoke against the god he had become, who disappeared into the sands and was never found. Some of them believe he's still out there, somewhere in the deep desert, and understand that. He'd hate it, a little understand that. He'd hate it, a little, but he'd understand. We build our messiahs out of real people, and then we mourn when the people don't survive the making. We ask the extraordinary to carry what the ordinary cannot, and we're always a little surprised when the carrying breaks them. We write prophecies and then we find people to fit them, and then we call it destiny, and we mean it as a compliment, and we don't always notice what it costs. Paul Atreides was real, in the way that the best characters in literature are real. More real sometimes than the actual world, and what he was asked to be was always, from the first breath, too much for any single human life. The tragedy is not that he failed. Oh, the tragedy is that he succeeded so completely that there was nothing left of him when it was over. The desert took him. The desert keeps him. And somewhere out there in the dark, past the edge of everything we can see, the sand is still warm from his passing. That's enough. Let's let him rest.